Oops. So good afternoon. Welcome to session D3, beginning to embed culturally responsive practices in the universal system. My name is Kent Smith. I am going to be one of the presenters along with Dr. Rose and Melanie Lieberson, and we will introduce ourselves a little more in depth in just a couple minutes. Before D3, the last of the three, you've heard the presentations around establishing commitment to equity and centering equity. So now we're going to talk about kind of thinking about how we can start embedding into our universal systems. As always, we want to give you a chance to review the expectations. Please, please, please make sure that you are familiar with how to use the chat tab and the poll tabs. We are going to be utilizing both of those. There are slides built into the presentation when we're going to key you into the specific poll questions. But if you want to work ahead, okay, feel free. And as far as the chat goes, please make sure to ask questions and we are frozen. There we go. Whoop, back. Some quick tips for you in terms of navigating the session. You see on the screen sort of your landing page for all of the interaction, the material, the poll questions, the people that are present, and how to access files. In the chat, it is being facilitated and being monitored. The Q&A is under the polls, so if you have questions for us, you can put the questions in there, or more specific questions when the polls are launched. We are saving time at the end of the session to address anything specifically that comes up. Also want to kind of encourage you to stay put. If you do end up away from the live stream, it looks like you're really excited about something that was said, so you go to that social media tab and you put something out on Twitter. If you want to find out more about us, that navigates you away. Please feel free to explore, but be aware that it may take you somewhere that you will have to return from. And we do have help standing by, so if you do start running into some issues, utilize the help desk feature at the top of your page, and that will get you the help that you need. So with those logistics pieces taken care of, we want to start the session by doing a brief land acknowledgement. Both Melanie and I are coming to you from West Central Wisconsin, and Dr. Rose is coming to you from the Chicago area. So we want to make sure that we acknowledge the first, present, and future stewards of the occupied lands that we're coming to you from. So in Melanie's case, she's coming to you from Anishinaabe-Waukee land and Oceti-Sakowin land. I'm coming to you from Oceti-Sakowin and Menominee land. And Dr. Rose is coming to you from Potawatomi, Oceti-Sakowin, Kickapoo, Miami, and Peoria. Melanie and I also want to take the opportunity to lift up our Menominee colleague and friend that we work with within the Wisconsin RTI Center, Kamea Wanuki, and thank her for her teaching and her comradeship in this journey that we've been on in the center for a while. We would also like,
I hate to interrupt you, but I'm seeing a bunch of messages in the chat that people have lost sound. So I just wanted to see if we could get a tech check-in on that.
Okay. I'm also going to try to turn my camera off. Let's see if that helps. I cannot turn the camera off. We do also want to encourage you to learn about the land that you are on, and you can do that by accessing the URL on your screen. It will allow you to look by your zip code, your address, or any number of other ways. We also want to acknowledge the Center on Pbis Equities Workgroup. This is a group that's been in existence for about 8 years and has led to a lot of the research development and the material that has been shown in the equity strand. And there's a lot of work that is still coming out of this group. So a quick shout out to that group. So with the acknowledgements and some of the logistics stuff taken care of, we want to make sure that we talk about the learning objectives. So by the end of this session, participants will have learned the history of public instruction and kind of how we've gotten to the point that we're at, understand some of the resources available to help embed culturally responsive practices, and identify those ways to begin to embed culturally responsive practices into your universal. So with that, who are we and why are we here? Dr. Rose.
Hi, everyone. My name is Dr. Jennifer Rose. First of all, greetings from Chicago. I am a school psychologist by trade. My PhD is in school psychology from Loyola University, Chicago. That is also not by happenstance the same place where I'm currently working, in a small community mental health clinic. I also have licensure as a clinical psychologist, so I bring you greetings.
Hello, everyone. I'm Melanie Leverson. I work with Kent Smith at the Wisconsin RTI Center. I am also trained, like Dr. Rose, as a school psychologist, and left that position to come and work for the RTI Center, where I am a Pbis Technical Assistance Coordinator and also one of the trainers for our culturally responsive systems training that we do here in the state.
And hello again, my name is Kent Smith. I am not a school psychologist by training. I am a social worker by training. I've been working with the Wisconsin RTI Center from the beginning of its existence, and prior to that was in a school district where we'd also been working on implementing Pbis and trying to address culturally responsive practices and educational disproportionality, where Melanie was also on staff. So with that, we're going to turn it over to Dr. Rose to take us through some of the history, and we'll go from there.
Okay, all right. Hang on one second. I'm going to share my screen. And hopefully everyone can see my screen. Okay, great. So it's good to be with you all. Be even better to see you guys in the flesh, but it is good to be here. As Kent mentioned earlier in the overview of our particular presentation, I'm going to be providing the historical context in which our whole presentation is situated today. And history is important because history tells us where we're going, it tells us who we are, and it can help influence where we go. So this is putting the US educational system within historical context, because many of the practices that we see in our schools now are related to longstanding values and norms and legal contexts that have influenced the way that we think about schooling and who should have access to schooling, and interactions between parents and schools, between students and schools, and how teachers look at students within the educational environment. So let's start at the beginning. So as Kent referenced, we are all living on occupied land. This is land that was originally occupied by Native Americans. Then in 1619, we had the arrival of the first Africans who were brought here to do labor. And at that time, so we have the first Africans who arrived in the British colony of Virginia. And within the first few decades of the arrival of first Africans, we start to see the foundations of our current educational system in terms of how and who and when has access to schooling. This is important because it helps shapes our viewpoints. If we think about implicit bias, our thinking without thinking, part of that is rooted within our experiences, and our experiences all are shaped by the historical context. So we start in 1680 with this idea of that we're not going to have Blacks establishing schools. That's something that's going to be barred. Again, the idea is we went from this original position of having Africans coming into the country to do labor to the transition of Africans as property. And as such, there was increasing control upon certain freedoms that other indentured or indentured servants or immigrants had that were gradually over time increasingly restricted to Blacks. If we look forward in 1695, you see again this encroachment on reducing access to education for Black students. So again, you've got that foundational imposition here about who has access to education. In 1740, you have, South Carolina flat out saying that it's illegal to teach slaves. So it started off small with certain restrictions, and then it became increasingly more restrictive. As we move forward and we look at the time after Reconstruction, we have this idea of, okay, great, now we no longer have slavery, we have access to schooling, isn't this great? But then when you look at the reality of the situation, is there true access? So if you think about the idea of having 200,000 Black children, okay, and then 9,000 teachers, then that gives you a good idea of what access to education probably look like for those Black children. So, I may not be a mathematician. I mean, my discipline is school psychology, but my math at least lends me to believe that there were far too few teachers for the number of students. Then beginning between the 1880s and the 1890s is when we had the establishment of the segregated school systems. And that's when it was formally, universally codified that we were going to have segregated schools. Again, the idea here is who has access, who belongs within the school environment. Okay. In 1896, we had the famous case of Plessy versus Ferguson. Okay, so this didn't exactly have to do with education, but it did have to do with who has access. So this is the case that's involving access to seating on public transportation. Pardon me. But this was foundational in terms of codifying and cementing within the legal system, within our social norms, the idea of having separate facilities. So you have facilities and access for whites and through one area, and then you have access and facilities for those who are not white in one area. So again, you have this idea of the separation and restriction of access to education for anyone who is not white. If we go again and we look further into school law, we see the Gong versus Wright Supreme Court ruling. Now, what's the significance of this? Is that in this case, the plaintiff was asking for access to schooling for their child who was of Asian ancestry. And the argument was based upon my child is not Black, therefore they should have access to schooling. But with this particular ruling, this is significant because this communicated again and reinforced the idea of who has access to schooling, who has access to educational resources. And within this context, this is reinforcing the message that these are the resources available to this group of people. i.e. people who identify and are identifiable as white, these are the resources and access that are available to anyone who is not white. So again, if you're thinking about how history and experience shapes our way of thinking, about our social norms, our biases, this is the historical context within the school system. Again, just kind of thinking about who has access. So this speaks to the issue of females. So if you think about it within the context of not only race or ethnicity, but we look at gender too. So with Black girls, we think about the situation involving Black females, that early on in the history of this country, there's this idea here being communicated by Andrew Judson that not only is it, Blackness, but it is specifically Black girls, that somehow it is something about the intersectionality or the identities of being both Black and female that somehow is viewed as being a negative. And that this is another reason for restricting persons fitting within those categories from accessing school. So then we see the impact or the history behind restricting Black girls, or how viewpoints have been shaped in terms of how people view Black girls within schools. And that has a direct connection to what we see in terms of disproportionality, in terms of suspensions, application of suspensions, and expulsions for Black girls in our schools today. Moving forward, here's another example of how we think about culture. So we started off with the timeline that talks about, okay, who has access to schooling? And as we look by the laws as they were originally established in the US, far before the beginning of the formal establishment of our country, going back to the 1680s, okay, we have one set of access for this group of people, another set for this. So we have that's already been established. Now we talk about, moving forward, okay, what is the purpose of schooling? Originally, public schools were established to bring people in to not only educate them academically, but there's also this idea of providing the whole context of socialization. What does it mean to be an American? So you have that whole piece of education too. But if we think about it from the aspect of how students were taught, then that in itself is a way of, okay, how are these messages communicated to children who are not white? So using Native American children as an example, we look at these pictures here. We see a picture on the left-hand side of 3 Native American male children, and we see them representing and standing proudly in their Native attire. On the right side, we see these youth with Americanized clothing, haircuts. So there's this idea of, in this case with the Native American schools, about the concept of assimilation. So when we think about it from that standpoint, if you think about what's going on, if you see the differences between these two pictures, it's the idea of how you're coming to the schoolhouse is not acceptable. We need you to be this way. So again, if we think about culture within the context of historical implications of how we have interacted and educated children who are not white, here's one example. So you can bring your culture to the door of the schoolhouse, but we're going to find a way to assimilate and change you to fit this type of culture. Moving forward, we have the landmark Brown versus Board of Education case, and there's actually 2-piece parts to it. Everyone thinks about, that famous quote, moving forward with desegregation with all deliberate speed. Well, there were actually 2 rulings, one in 1954 and one in 1955. The first ruling in 54 was the ruling that, hey, separate but equal doesn't stand. So this is striking down Plessy versus Ferguson, which was huge, huge. And not coincidentally, from the standpoint of culture, from the standpoint of self-concept, one of the key pieces of evidence that helped to sway the justice's opinion about who should have access to school had to do with the Clark-Doll studies. This idea that having Black children separated from their peers was actually affecting their self-esteem, that somehow being segregated, being excluded, communicated to these very young children that there's something that's not right with you, and affected their self-esteem such that when presented with two dolls, one doll that looks like them, a brown baby, and another doll that looks white, these little Black children were invariably picking these white dolls. And the information that was obtained from that study by Mamie Clark was instrumental in swaying the justice's opinion, because you could see the psychological impact upon children who had been systematically excluded from schooling based upon the laws that had been enacted in the United States, again, from the very beginning of the founding of our country. So moving forward, those of us who are in this webinar who are old enough to remember the desegregation process, during the 60s, during the 70s, the 80s, and the 90s, was fraught with a lot of tension. And this actually sets the stage for what was to come in terms of the integration of children who are not white into schools. So, we see up in the upper right-hand corner, the picture of Ruby Bridges, the 6-year-old who integrated the New Orleans schools, being escorted to school by federal marshals, walking through the gauntlet of crowds who were screaming all of these abusive slurs at this child. So again, there's this idea, going back to the laws of who belongs in school, what's appropriate. So again, just thinking about that, we have this whole history that we're bringing with us in terms of access and how we integrate children into schools. That brings us fast forward to the present. So what we're seeing now, and I'm not going to read all this for you, and I apologize for all the information on here, but you will have copies of the PowerPoint. And I thought that this quote from Dr. Tatum was so important, because it speaks to the issue that here we are, many, many, many years after the Brown ruling, is that schools are just as segregated as they were at the time of the ruling, that we have not made that progress. That you still have children of color attending majority minority schools. That we're still seeing the separation, and that, this is, not dissimilar for Latinx students. And even within schools where we have both Black and white and Latinx students, there is another phenomenon that has replaced segregation with a new form of segregation. And this form of segregation we will call microsegregation. So if you all are familiar, and I'm sure with all the educators in the audience, if you're familiar with the idea of tracking, microsegregation is directly related to the idea of tracking. Well, how does that happen? What does that mean? Well, what that means is when you group kids intentionally based upon ability, that what we're seeing is this trend is that even within schools where we have Black, white, Latinx students, Asian students, et cetera, that we are seeing tracking. And often that tracking is along racial lines. And it has to do with, again, this idea of access. It has to do with how we think about determining who has access to certain schooling. So in this case, it's who has access to the honors classes, Who has access to the AP classes? Who has access to different groups in outside extracurricular? All of those play into this idea of microsegregation. And so even though we have Black and brown and other children attending school with white peers, again, this idea of separation that seemingly appears by racial ethnic group, again, we can go right back to the Brown decision in the research that influenced the justice's decision, that children are still seeing that I don't belong. There's certain spaces where I don't fit. There's not other people like me. And this, again, ties right into this idea of culture, what's acceptable, who is okay in this space, who has a right to be in this space. So then moving forward, as we got into the phase of desegregation to the degree that it occurred, another way of instituting this idea of segregation is discipline, how we apply discipline. So who gets to attend school? And with this sorting process, it's through the application or the disproportionate application of punitive discipline. So whereas, you have kids who have committed the same type of disciplinary infraction, having Black and brown students receive more severe punishments, and often that punishment including being excluded from school. Again, the number of suspensions is, has been found to be associated with school engagement and with dropout rates, with academic progress. So again, this is another way of segregating or changing the makeup of our schools. This data is a little old, but it's still relevant if we look at this information in terms of who is expelled, who receives the suspensions. And if we look at this bar down here in the red area, we see as we look at relative to enrollment on this side, and we look at out of school suspensions, single and multiple, and expulsions, relative to the percentage of representation, the overall enrollment, it is disproportionately our African American students who are affected by exclusionary discipline vis-a-vis our white students, and even based upon this data, even our Latino students. And even when we look at our youngest children, we are looking at our babies. This is preschool. We still see this type of trend that is where we have, if we look at the enrollment, and then we look at suspensions. And again, I'm trying to wrap my mind around, remember, school psychologist here, I'm still trying to wrap my mind around why is it necessary to provide an out of school suspension for a preschooler. This is data from a previous study by Vincent et al. That talks about the effect of school-wide Pbis. And again, this is relevant because it shows us that over time, when you implement school-wide Pbis with fidelity, that all students benefit from it in terms of the reduction in disciplinary measures. But again, even with the implementation of school-wide Pbis, we're still seeing a disproportionate impact upon African American students. This is just more of the same data looking at this information as well. So again, we move from, if we look at our historical context, we move from formalized laws that codify the idea of who attends to now we're moving from the macro segregation to the micro segregation in terms of ability tracking, academic tracking, and discipline. So at this point, we would like you to respond to poll question number 1. Where are you on your journey? I think that's the first question. Okay.
So we'll use this information when we get to kind of the Q&A to help us figure out a little bit about where we want to go and to address any of the questions you've got. Thank you, Dr. Rose. So what we're going to do is shift gears a little bit into thinking about things in a little bit of a different way. So we've gotten to this point, not by accident. We've gotten to this point through how our systems have been designed and how our systems have been maintained. It's also important to understand that the roots of disproportionality is really complex. There's not one cause. So on the screen, you see a lot of these different sort of factors that contribute into it. And Dr. Rose talked about things like policies and practices, who has access to advanced placement courses, who has access to the instruction itself, how are we choosing instruction, the materials that we use, the methodology that we use. Do we have practices and policies that lead to an over-reliance on exclusion? Things like how do we engage family and the community in what we do? How do we set up our learning environment? Who is reflected in our learning environment? Whose history is taught in our learning environment? How do we allow students to model their learning? We need to start thinking about things like our expectations, the misconceptions or biases that we have that come into practice with it. And ultimately thinking about cultural dissonance. So the equity work group that I showed you at the beginning of the session has created over the last number of years a bunch of resources, products to help schools think about this. You see screenshots on your screen and they're available to you in the materials section of your landing page. We're going to spend the rest of this session focusing on one particular resource, which is the Pbis Culturally Responsive Field Guide resource for trainers and coaches. Looks like this. So this is in its second iteration. It was cleaned up and refined, revised in 2019 based on feedback we had received from people that have been using it in the field. Things that were working really, really well, cleaning up some things that weren't working so well. But what's held true over the last number of years is that this does provide some places for schools to begin to adjust their systems. So we're going to talk really quick about the CR guide in general. There are three main parts to the guide that really are going to be important for you to know about. The first part is a big chunk of it focused on identity discussion. So when we talk about identity and identity development in this guide, we want not only individual practitioners to kind of understand where they're coming from, the things that they bring to the table, they bring to their practice, the collective identity that's formed by all of the practitioners in your school based on their common experiences, the community identity of the school, the practitioners and the families served, but also the role of identity with the families and the students that we serve within our schools. So really understanding that identity is complex, that there are a lot of different aspects to this, that as systems and as practitioners, we need to understand to be able to know how to manage the dynamics of difference. There's the companion itself, which looks at the tiered fidelity inventory, walks through the individual line items, explains what sort of the big Pbis idea at tier 1 is, but then allows us to think about how do we elaborate on it from a culturally responsive lens. So thinking about things like how do we increase stakeholder input? How do we increase family voice in the systems? How do we use data? How do we focus on creating a supportive environment? So we'll talk about those a little bit later in the session. And then lastly, there's an appendix that has additional resources, activities, lesson plans, things that you can use with your staff to help not only teach them, but build their capacity and their understanding in this as well. We're not interested in teaching people, kind of a one and done approach. we're really interested in making sure that the work that happens really takes hold and is sustainable over time. So those are the main parts. How to do this. So in our estimation, this first thing is a non-negotiable, that there has to be a commitment to doing the identity work as a part of this change process. Ideally, your Pbis leadership team is going to do some of this identity work ahead of time. So making sure that staff understand that there's a commitment, they've been exploring some of these issues related to identity, kind of have devoted time and resource and professional development to being able to do it. However, especially in 2020, we also understand that, sometimes the ideal is not practical, right? So if you can't do it ahead of time, at least plan on doing it at the same time, right? So as you're working on some of the system changes and addressing some of the Pbis universal structures, also doing the identity work at the same time. This can't be left to chance, and this can't be something that's pushed down the road. So addressing the identity pieces. Second, completing the tiered fidelity inventory. Identifying the areas that are really robust, the things that are in place, and the areas for potential growth. Once you've done that, you can start thinking about, so what do we do with this? If you're a new implementer, you're building a system, right? So the places that are showing up on the tiered fidelity inventory, you can start addressing from the beginning, right? Put those pieces in place as you build your system. Conversely, if you are a sustaining school, you are well established and you're looking at things that you're needing refreshing, you can go back and refine those, right? So the TFI will help identify the areas and give you some ideas on where to start embedding. Reading the screen, the big takeaway from this is that you want, as a leadership team, a Pbis team, to be thinking about movement. I mentioned to you at the beginning of this that Melanie and I had worked in the district prior to the Wisconsin RTI Center starting. And one of the lessons that we learned when we were working on our own disproportionality stuff was that looking at the data is an important part. We need to understand what we're working with, but we also need to move beyond just sort of this generic problem admiring stance. We need to be able to start thinking about specific actions, concrete ways of counteracting the outcomes that we're getting. So Wisconsin has developed this model that you see on your screen called the model to inform culturally responsive practices. What this does is helps schools identify these 8 areas that they can begin to shift their system, that they can begin to address equity issues in their schools, especially coming at it through a culturally responsive practices lens. There's big ideas, right? Developing within your school the desire to lead or will building and gaining cultural knowledge about the students and the families that we serve, the communities that we serve, but then also applying that knowledge. Within those bigger buckets, there's smaller incremental steps. We already addressed the becoming self-aware piece. Our recommendation for leadership teams, aside from doing that, is to begin by examining this system's impact on families and students. So what does this mean? This means, as a leadership team, that what you're going to want to start thinking about is, what is your current reality? What are the outcomes that your system is getting based on kind of how you deliver your services, and going from there. So the easiest way to do this is starting with this thing called a risk ratio. And please, please, please understand, risk ratio is not the definitive, like this is going to solve our problem. Risk ratio is where the conversation starts. And what a risk ratio is the probability of an event occurring in one group compared to the probability of the event occurring in a comparison group. Okay, I'm a social worker, math, statistics, we don't always get along. So I was kind of struggling wrapping my head around this until we kind of started applying it to an example. So We've all heard the story that when you're talking about speeding tickets, people that are driving red cars or red sports cars or red convertibles are going to get tickets at a higher rate. Well, turns out that's not true. So here's how a risk ratio works, using something that's a little bit easier than talking about racial and cultural disproportionality. When we talk about a risk ratio, the outcome that we're looking at is the likelihood of getting a speeding ticket. So when you think about all drivers dumped into a pool around the country, we're going to call that the average driver, and you have the same likelihood statistically as everybody else. You have a risk ratio of 1. However, when you start looking at the data, who are the tickets issued to? You see a different pattern emerge. So it turns out this insurance institute that commissioned this study found that men specifically that drove Volkswagen GTIs and Mercedes Benzes were twice as likely to get speeding tickets as the average driver. Even more significant was the fact that men that drove Humvees got speeding tickets at a rate 4.5 times greater than the average driver, right? So a risk ratio doesn't tell us why that's happening, but a risk ratio does tell us that given how we're currently operating, we see these outcomes. If we apply that to education and we apply that to disproportionality, excuse me, we start seeing that disproportionality, those outcomes that Dr. Rose shared earlier, right? So when we talk about using data, we're really doing it to identify the impact of our universal on all of our students. Risk ratio is essentially sort of the canary in the coal mine. It tells us that something's going on that we need to pay attention to. It allows us to focus on our continuous improvement cycle, identify potential areas for policy revision, and address discipline alternatives. So when we talk about continuous improvement, risk ratio starts the conversation helping us identify, is there a problem? Why is it happening? What are we going to do about it? And then once we put that plan into place, how do we know it's working? So we wanted you to think about how do we start using data to think about things differently. So I'm going to invite you to respond to poll question number 2 while Mulaney takes us into the next chunk.
Thanks, Kent. Just want to be sure I get this screen sharing down right. So as you're replying to poll number 2, I want to thank those of you who've been sharing in the chat. There's a ton of great information in there. A lot of people making some really amazing efforts toward decreasing disproportionality in their schools and increasing equity, working on, I saw a little bit of trying to get stakeholders involved, but a lot of working on restorative practices. And I think this next section that I'm going to move us through really speaks to the fact that this issue that we have, is long-standing as it is, that as Dr. Rose illustrated so well earlier, is not something that can be solved with just an intervention alone or just taking a different approach. So when Kent mentioned earlier that we want to talk about identity and bias, this is especially true in a state like Wisconsin. In Wisconsin, most of our educators are white females, 72%. So when we think about what that means for the systems we set up, it becomes very, very critical that we start to examine who we are and what we bring to the table. What does that mean? So when we talk about identity and the role that it plays, our thought around how to really change things in schools is, number one, yes, do the practices that work for the students who we're not serving well. Bring in restorative practices. That's amazing. Bring in the pieces that we know will work for them. But the second piece that has to go hand in hand with that is evaluating our systems from the bottom up. So when we talk about identity, we're thinking identity of practitioners specifically, not just our students and who they are, but who are we as adults, as human beings? What are our defaults on behavior, communication, styles, belief systems? If we don't know our defaults, then we won't know how those defaults contribute to our collective identity as a staff. That collective identity as a staff is going to set up what's normal, what's appropriate, what's good, what's bad, what's right, what's wrong. That all is going to come from this collective identity that in many cases we're not even aware exists. So the more similar the backgrounds of the staff that are setting up the system, the stronger, the more reinforced that default is going to be. And we know that many educators have similar backgrounds. Many of them obviously have gone to college. They might live in kind of middle class areas right now because of the fact that they are educators and they get similar incomes. So we have to consider those similarities when we're thinking about how our systems are set up. The other things that can be influenced by identity, things like pedagogy, how we interact with other people, how we establish environments, what we expect from people in environments, our definitions of behavior and of words like appropriate, words like disrespect can be very differently defined based on who we are and where we come from. Our styles, our method of correction, we may jump right to punishment versus jumping to instruction because that's how we were raised. And we have to address this piece of fear. So things like media bias and systemic racism and age and pain and aggression studies, what we know is that this is no longer something that we can ignore for our students. And the reality is that in a state like Wisconsin, when I say that 72% of our educators are white females, that means that 72% of our educators have basically no idea what it might feel like to live in this fear every day. Our students do. Dr. LaSalle yesterday talked about how our students and our Black families, our African-American families live in this fear. This is something that we can no longer ignore. So if you're wondering why are two white people joining the amazing Dr. Rose and talking about this, it's because in Wisconsin and across the nation, we see a pattern of white educators failing Black and brown students. And we believe that the only way to change that is to be a voice, to use our privilege to speak up and make a change in our systems, not in our students. Our students are not the problem. So that identity piece, when we think about identity work, you may be wondering what that means. In general, we're looking at things like raising awarenesses of biases and defaults. So some of the biases I talked about before, some of those defaults around pedagogy and how we error correct and what we think is appropriate, we want to bring that to the surface, not so that we can say that everybody's wrong, but so that we can start to address every situation through the lens of my bias in this situation might be this. And then we have another stop. We have a pause where we can think about whether or not that's going to negatively impact our students or our system. So we're raising that awareness. Some ways to do that are to look for information from Dr. McIntosh, who's leading our chat right now, on vulnerable decision points. Amazing work, very, very easy to implement in your schools. You start to look for those places where you're more likely to rely on your biases, like when you're hungry, perhaps, when you're stressed. We might rely on our biases to make snap decisions. And then you build in specific steps to be sure that you're not doing that we're addressing those biases before they impact a situation. Other things we can do, the Wisconsin RTI Center adopted from the amazing Andrell Davis, who's our culturally responsive practices coordinator, this theory or this set of practices called the 7 experiences. It's something you can find on our website, and I'm guessing someone will put it in the chat. But that is an amazing way to get people really involved in learning who your community is, who's represented, and what that means for your school and your system. Beyond diversity from the Pacific Education Group, we've had many people have success with that. Kent and I have been through that training as well with our previous district. They have some really amazing information. Things like courageous conversations, incorporating awareness into decision-making, and then I mentioned those vulnerable decision points, VDPs. Another reason to do this identity work is to try to control for subjectivity and consequence. So we want to be sure that we're looking for our individual biases, what those mean collectively, and then making space to control for those within our system. We can only do that by including family and student voice. We won't know where to make space unless we know where there might be a difference. We need to be sure that we're reteaching for fluency and identifying when space for home culture can be created. And I see that there's a chat about ideas regarding code switching being implemented within PBIS to address cultural responsiveness.
Mulaney, I'm working on that in the chat.
Okay.
So.
I'll also mention it here because I think this bullet kind of gets at that question a little bit. We talk a lot about code switching in our systems training in Wisconsin. We talk about it a lot internally as well, and the fact that as adults, we're often asked to code switch based on situations. And we do bring that up as a way to help educators figure out how to best teach their students to manage different situations and to move between situations. However, we teach it with an additional layer of, we want you to look at the codes that you're asking students to switch away from. We want you to learn those codes, figure out what they are, figure out why they exist, and then figure out how you can make room for them in your schools. So Kent and I had a situation once in a school that we worked in where we had a student in first grade. He was very enthusiastic about school, so much so that he was always moving, always blurting out, always jumping up, always getting in trouble. Sent to the office 70 times or something by the time October rolled around. It was not a good situation. Their PBIS was kind of faltering. But what we found out about this student is that he was attending school in a different country during the summer and before he ever came to school in our setting. In those settings, it was expected to be excited about learning. It wasn't expected to show respect for learning by sitting still and quietly and never speaking or engaging, which is what the teacher wanted because of how that teacher, what the values that she brought to that classroom. But what was expected was that you showed up excited and you blurted out and you jumped up and you raised your hand and just, you were there, like physically present. And that's something that as we move through the conversation with that student and the family, that was really frustrating. We came to an understanding that our system wasn't set up to appreciate that or to bring that to light. And that doesn't make it wrong. So when we think about code switching as educators, we have to remember that if we're asking a student to code switch from a home behavior or a community behavior, there may be space within our system where those behaviors are going to make sense, and we should be using them because actually they'll give our students a much more diverse opportunity in our system as a whole. At the very bottom, we have increased family engagement. You'll hear that come up as a common theme because you cannot do this work unless you engage your families and your students in the work. When we talk about practitioner identity, we're thinking about helping practitioners identify their own cultural identities. So what is my cultural identity as a white female? How does that impact my engagement in the work and how I engage with others in this work? How do our collective identities impact how our schools operate? So if you've seen the picture of the students standing at the fence trying to watch the baseball game, or kids, I guess, and then they say equity is when each one has the number of boxes they need to be able to see over the fence. And now there are newer ones where the fence is gone. And then people say that the kids get hit in the face by the baseball. Really what we're trying to do is ensure that we're making sure that our systems operate in a way that is beneficial to our students and not just to the adults in the systems. So we really want you to, like I said earlier, yes, engage in all of the best practices for our students. Please do that. But also start to question all of the things that have always been in place and that we've always done. Because as Dr. Rose pointed out, this is historical. This has been going on for far longer than any of our involvement. And we are complicit in it unless we start to question it. So some tools to get at that practitioner identity. Things like cultural autobiographies, as you saw in the keynote with Dr. Sugai. Things like the Harvard Implicit Association test that can get at some of your biases that they have been doing for years and have amazing data on. And then we even use something in Wisconsin called the True Colors or the Compass Points. They're kind of a loose personality assessment, I guess I would say. And essentially what they do is give you kind of a soft entry into what it would be like to feel stereotyped based on your color, or to feel like your color, and when I say color, I'm speaking of true colors, so the colors that designate personality types, what it might be like to have a personality type that didn't fit the system that was that you were expected to be in. So one way to get some of our white educators, our white colleagues, to have a different view on what we're talking about and potentially not just put up a wall because they don't want to be called racist. So when we think about bias and worldview and what that means for our discipline patterns, many of you probably know, I'm guessing you're engaged in this work already, but there is very clear data that shows us that our students of color are receiving referrals for more subjective behaviors. Our students of color are getting more significant consequences for minor behaviors, for those subjective behaviors. And that pattern tends to play out in our discipline data across our state, across the nation. It's something that we see that contributes to the school to prison pipeline. So when we use the data concepts from earlier, we talk about those the risk ratios and the action plans that we can create from those to look at our professional development needs. Then we can move back into that CRTFI guide that Kent mentioned earlier and start to look specifically at some areas that will give us some guidance on actual actions. Because part of this work, part of the difficulty of this work is moving it out of a theoretical conversation where we all feel like we want to do something different and into action. So in the guide, we're going to touch on a few different pages. There are quite a few in there. We're not going to show you the whole thing, and we wouldn't recommend reading the whole thing all at once. But we will show you a few different spots where this work typically can begin and give you a little bit of information about what that could look like. So first of all, when we start to look at data patterns, one of the things that can be helpful is to start looking at referrals by problem behavior. If we know that the data shows us that our students of color are receiving more referrals for subjective behaviors, that's something we want to specifically look for in our system. If that pattern exists in the outside world, we want to specifically narrow that down and see if we are also following true to that pattern. When we do that, we have to dig into our data, keep digging, so that we start to see then who are the students that are getting those referrals? What does that look like? And then move into how are we defining these behaviors, these problem behaviors? So this gets at a CR concept of situational appropriateness. And that's a little bit like that code switching that we talked about earlier. But again, we don't want students only switching to our code as educators. That's not enough to change practices. That's not enough to change outcomes and what we're doing. So the big idea of problem behavior definitions is that we have clearly defined problem behaviors that give clarity to students and staff that help us respond to those inappropriate behaviors objectively. When we think about that from a culturally responsive standpoint, what we need to do is help our staff understand the difference between universally unacceptable and situationally inappropriate behaviors. So we're getting at some of that code switching conversation, but we want to be sure that when we're doing that, we're really thinking about why our code is the way it is. So what is the reason behind the different expectations that we have? What's the expectation overall, and why do we define things the way we do? And then there are some pieces of the guide, this is a page directly out of the guide, that give you examples of activities to do to help your problem behavior definitions become better, more culturally responsive. We have some schools in Wisconsin that have taken this and just run with it, and they've eliminated disrespect, defiance, and disruption, those 3 Ds, from their problem behavior categories overall. Don't tell Swiss, don't tell Kent McIntosh. But they're making an effort to eliminate those subjective pieces from their system in order to ensure that when they say a student isn't behaving appropriately, that they're being very specific and that it's very purposeful. Some other places that situational appropriateness come up are within our behavioral expectations and our teaching expectations. So this, even within the social justice movement that's been happening over this summer, we've been hearing a lot about how social emotional learning standards can be another way to sort of reinforce this dominant white society mentality of what is right and what is wrong. These parts of the guide also address that. We cannot define appropriate behaviors only through the lens of dominant white educators. It's not enough. So we have to think about our behavioral expectations overall. We have to think about what that means when we teach it. And we have to consider that we need family and student voice in these pieces. Earlier, in a session earlier, I think someone asked for a matrix example that wasn't just white dominant society. This is one example that comes directly from the guide. This is connected to our colleague, the colleague that Kent mentioned earlier, Kame Wanuki, and her Menominee culture. And they added pieces to this matrix to honor the Menominee culture. So they have a spot for prayer. They have a spot for Menominee thinking mode time. And then they talk about whole class activities, small group activities, and transitions. This is specifically a classroom matrix, so not school-wide. But as a classroom matrix, you can see that there's plenty of room to bring in pieces of your students' culture, pieces of your community's culture, and teach those alongside whatever we decide is critical to teach in our classrooms and in our schools. Again, we're going to bring up families, family voice, family and student voice. We know that engaging families and increasing family ownership is going to break up the similarities that we see in our school staff. The other piece of this that we can do is we can really work to get our families to be a valuable part of our school system. We need them there. We need them showing up. We need their voice. We need their leadership. We cannot work in isolation anymore in our schools and districts. This will help us reframe the values of our school so that they reflect the values of our stakeholders and not just the educators in the building. This allows for our community to have ownership over the outcomes. This is only going to work though if our schools are intentionally seeking out all family representation. So when we talk about family and student voice in the guide, one of the things that comes up is team composition within the TFI. I know that one of the expectations is that you have a family member on your PBIS leadership team. And while that is amazing and great, what that sometimes translates to in practice is that we have teams, PBIS teams, with a Phi Ed teacher who is also a parent in the building on the team, wearing 2 hats. The difficulty there is that while that person is probably amazing and probably does a great job with both hats, they're not going to give us the family lens that we truly need, which is that of looking in from outside. What does our school look like? How can we shift so that you feel like a valued member of our community and like you have ownership in this community? And then you can see we also move into family and student voice here, 1.11, and that gets at making sure that we have voice in the development of our system overall. Not just sending a brochure home, but two-way communication. So soliciting feedback and using that feedback to make changes in our systems and really ensure that our systems are strong. Another piece of this is looking at our policies overall. So one thing that we've noticed as we've been working with schools over the years is that it's very common for schools to change practice at the building level, but then not think to address those underlying policies at the district level that can be problematic when they come in, when they clash with each other. So when we think about implementing or revising policies, we have to be sure that there are some pieces in place. Number one, it needs to be on our minds. We need to consider that when we decide to move away from zero tolerance policies as a building, that also is reflected in our board policy and our district policy as well, so that those things won't come in conflict with each other. Once we do that, if we make those changes in policies, we have to make sure that we're communicating that out. People will never follow a policy they don't know about. We have to make sure we're conducting ongoing training so that people know how to follow the policy that we've established. We need to use action plans and fidelity tools to assess whether or not people are following it after we've taught it. This should sound familiar, a lot like what we do with students. And then at the very bottom there, we want to look to see whether or not our changes are resulting in more equitable outcomes. So if you choose to implement some of these practices, consider where you can shift your policy, building or district, board, wherever, to reflect the fact that you're making these shifts. One of the tools to look through your policies and look for inequities or look for places where things are likely going to lead to inequities is this amazing tool from the Great Lakes Equity Center. It's called the Policy Equity Analysis Tool. And it helps to examine your policies kind of line by line to think about whether or not they are really going to contribute to the success of all students. And finally, in conclusion, what we've talked about today, it's a lot, I know, in a short amount of time, and there's a lot more in the guide. So we would encourage you to go there and learn as much as you can and ask us any questions, give us any feedback. We're very open to making changes, making additions. We'd love to see what you're doing. But overall, we want to really focus on the fact that the outcomes we're getting are based on the systems that we have built or the systems that we have been handed and that we're sustaining. We can't just focus on an intervention or fixing a group of students. We have to think about that system as a whole. That's why culturally responsive practices and PBIS go so closely together, hand in hand. That's why it's so critical to address this through a systems approach. And if we never examine how we operate or why we operate the way we do, the impact that we have on all students isn't going to change. So with that, I'd like to open the floor, or that last poll I think has been open this entire time, thanks to Kent McIntosh, for questions and answers. And if anybody sees those and wants to read them out, perhaps we could address them as a group.
We are getting some questions about access to the policy analysis tool, True Colors, and we're trying to find them in the background. For those of you that are looking for some of those resources, we will upload them to this website again later. They're also linked in the field guide that you can find in the files section of Pathable.
I wanted to jump in here because there was a question about situational appropriateness, and I was just kind of thinking this through. So, and you guys can, of course, add in if you have thoughts about this too. So I spent some time talking about the history, about who was included, who was considered eligible for access to schooling. So that has hard baked in a whole set of values and norms about what's appropriate in schools. Okay. I think one of the participants said, well, there's certain universal norms for what it means to be a professional. But we have to think about what were the origin of those norms. Where did those norms come from? How did we decide what's appropriate, where, and when? So that's number one. So in trying to make that bridge between people who were systematically excluded and had no voice in said establishment of norms, comes the piece where we actively recruit, solicit, engage, recognize, and value family, community, and student voice. So when we're developing a matrix about behavioral expectations, then we have a conversation about expectations. Because here's the thing, if you want people to really buy into something, give them a voice in that process. So when we're talking about what's the expectation for how you should behave during, say, a class discussion, and we are involving the students in said conversation and their parents and the community, then we can come up with a bridge of what is situationally appropriate. And the parents can reinforce that with the kids of the why. So it's not some other entity saying you will behave this way because of whatever reason we have. It's a collective we that have said, yes, we agree that it's important to behave in this kind of way, in this kind of setting, because this is going to be the desired outcome for you as a student, as a child. Sorry about that little sermon, but.
Oh, perfect.
We were just given notice, so we got 5 minutes left. There are a couple of things that came up in polls. The question specifically to us. So as we take those, can you also make sure that you please, please, please take the survey? We like to practice what we preach. We need data. So there was a question, how do you suggest to bring colleagues who are in denial of implicit bias or offended by white fragility, etc.?
I think I saw a similar question in an earlier session. I was hoping no one would ask us.
So there's that one. How do you get educators that don't believe in white privilege or equity problems to engage in this work? And then a question about really, how do we do this? There's an urgency of now, but with everything that's going on. So I think to take on the question about the white colleagues and people afraid of implicit bias and white fragility and stuff, I think understand that everyone's journey in this is going to be different, right? We all go through phases of how we understand ourselves in relation to this work. And it really is, while I think a lot of people want to get in the ring and start boxing, and the analogy is used a lot where we've got to learn to walk first, and we've got people that are trying to crawl. So I think it's a matter of really just continuing to have those conversations, to model, to step in, to continue to push, and really don't let those conversations be a distraction, right? I mean, there's bigger system things that are at play that we really have to take on, and we just kind of keep marching, and you still hold people accountable. You still have the conversations because they're necessary. But I think that's also probably like a 3-day discourse in 30 seconds. Anybody else have something to add?
I think one of the things that has been most impactful in some of our work is trying to make this personal. And arguably, the true colors, like a personality assessment, is not a clear line to what it would feel like to be discriminated against because of your race, obviously. However, what Kent mentioned and what our Andrell Davis, our leader in our state, has said to us before is you have to really meet people where they're at. And I feel this constant struggle between meeting people where they're at, being patient and trying to nurture that growth, and also the fact that houses are on fire. And I think that struggle is the place where if you're really, really committed to this work, that struggle is probably where you're going to live for any number of years. I do think the making it personal, the trying to connect in any way possible is probably going to be your best bet. When we talk about personality styles, a lot of times that can get a little personal because many people have or remember a child or someone in their life who wasn't a direction follower and went to school and wasn't successful in a lot of settings because they didn't like to read the directions. They just like to go through, jump in and get started. And that's a valuable trait in a lot of settings. So we have to honor some of that. Jen.
We're at the 1-minute warning. And I hated to cut off my colleague,
No, do it.
Superstar. But I do want to put in a quick plug for Loyola University School Discipline Reform Certificate Program. I teach the capstone course. So if you want to have an opportunity to learn more about this work, for those of you all who are interested in doing a deeper dive and learn more about this, I invite you to visit our website, Loyola University Chicago, so you can find more information about that training experience. You have our contact information in the PowerPoint. Please feel free to reach out to Melanie, myself, or Kent with additional questions. This is our life's work and passion, and we'd love to hear from you. Thank you for everyone who attended this session.
Thank you.